What's going on, you guys? My name's Brobson, and today I'm going to be showing you the pre-raid and raid best in slot gear lists for Warlocks in Phase 3 of Classic World of Warcraft. Now that the Blackwing Lair has been released, a lot of new items are available, and a lot of players are scrambling to figure out which pieces are mathematically the best for their character's DPS. While there are a lot of helpful resources and websites out there that give BiS lists, a lot of them have conflicting information, and some of them don't really go into depth explaining why certain items are better than others in certain scenarios. So I wanted to give you my take on the pre-raid and raid BiS gear for Warlocks, kind of go into depth explaining the build and why I think certain items are better than others in each gear slot. I'll be going over kind of an overview of the build and then going into each individual gear slot and giving you the best item and then, when applicable, some alternative items as well. And all of the information in this video will be available in the description, so if you want to see the builds that I've created or mess around with creating your own, you can do so. I'll also be linking the simulation sheet for Warlocks that I used to get to this conclusion and create these lists, so you can sim out different gear sets and try different builds on your own if you want, see how it'll perform. And also there'll be a table of contents, so if you just want to skip to a specific part of the video, use the table of contents, click the timestamp, and you'll get to that point. If you find something useful in this video or you enjoy it, make sure you leave a like and also subscribe for future content, because I do plan to make more World of Warcraft content moving forward with Classic, specifically Warlock related, as that is my main class. But let's get started now with the pre-raid best in slot gear for Warlocks. This will be the best in slot gear you can get before raiding in Phase 3, and we're going to be excluding ranked PvP gear and world boss gear. That's going to be both the pre-raid and raid best in slot lists that exclude these two things. The reason is because 99.9% of the player base is not going to have access to rank 14 weapons and are not going to be able to farm world bosses each time they spawn to be able to get those really good shadow power legs from Doomlord Kha'Zix. So it's not realistic to expect that every player is going to be able to get those extremely rare items, and therefore we're going to make a more realistic build that excludes rank PvP and world boss farming. So for pre-raid, the name of the game is Spellpower. We are just going to be stacking Spellpower as high as we possibly can, and not necessarily ignoring other stats, but just putting a much heavier emphasis on Spellpower than anything else. While both crit and hit are incredibly useful stats for a Warlock, there's simply not enough of it yet in Phase 3 available to move the needle enough. And therefore it's better to just go for flat out spell power increases on every piece rather than getting a piece of crit or hit here or there. Again, you'll miss a lot with raid bosses specifically. They're calculated to be 3 levels higher than you, which means by default you'll miss 17% of your spells without any spell hit gear. That's a lot, but we want to make sure that when we do hit, we're hitting as hard as possible, and that's why we're stacking spell power. Another reason spell power is so impactful that a lot of people actually don't know about is that your life tap values are based on your spell power coefficient. And what this means is that the more spell power you have, the more mana you're going to restore from each individual life tap. And as we all know, life tap uses a global cooldown, so every time you life tap, that's 1.5 seconds that you're not casting Shadow Bolt. So the less you can life tap, the better, because less life taps means more Shadow Bolts. And again, the higher your spell power is, the less you'll have to life tap, meaning the more you can Shadow Bolt, meaning more overall damage. It's just really, really good. And the last thing to mention with why spell power is so valuable is because of scaling with different buffs. There are quite a few buffs that Warlocks get that scale based on a percentage of your overall spell power, like the Demonic Sacrifice buff from sacrificing your Succubus increases your spell power by 15%. So the more spell power you have on gear, the more impactful that 15% is going to be, the higher that 15% value will be. Because it's like, for example, 15% of 500 is a lot more than 15% of 300. So if you can get up to 500 spell power as opposed to 300, that 15% is going to be more impactful. And the Demonic Sacrifice buff is not the only one. If you have a Shadow Priest in your raid, you're going to be getting Shadow Vulnerability, which is another 15%. And it's just, it can scale out of control when you look at every little min-max buff and consumable you can get. So Shadow Power is going to be extremely impactful. And therefore your pre-raid gear is going to be all centered around stacking Shadow Power as high as possible. That said, let's get into the individual items. First up in the helmet slot, we have got the Resplendent Circlet of Shadow Wrath. It does not matter which named item you go for. It doesn't have to be the Resplendent Circlet. It can be the Master Circlet. There are quite a few different named greens. They are BOE world drops, and they offer a range of shadow spell power in the form of an Of Shadow Wrath roll. On the helmet specifically, you're just looking for plus 40. That is the maximum value that can roll on a helmet. So whether it's a Resplendent Circlet of Shadow Wrath or a Master's Circlet of Shadow Wrath, you just want to find any of Shadow Wrath green BOE with plus 40 shadow damage. It's incredibly strong for a helmet slot. 40 is a lot of shadow damage and a lot of spell power, and this is your best option in the helmet spot. If you are an engineer, you can get a very, very close second option, which is the green lens of Shadow Wrath. This requires 245 engineering, and if you get the green lens of Shadow Wrath, it will have 36 shadow damage on it, so it's just 4 spell power less than the max roll green BOE. But if you can afford it, go for the plus 40. It is better, and again, once you factor in all the scaling and all the different buffs you can get, 4 spell power ends up being more than 4 spell power. So you're going to want the Resplendent Circlet if you can get it. Just the plus 40 of Shadow Wrath is what you're looking for here. A third option is the Crimson Felt Hat. This drops from Magistrate Bartholas, who's the third to last boss in Stratholme Undead side. It's pretty common and easy to farm. This will provide you with 30 spell power as well as some base stats. 8 intellect is like 0.15% crit, so not terrible there with base stats, but it is 10 spell power less than the max of Shadow Wrath roll. So check your auction house, just wait until you find a plus 40 listing and then buy it. I had to pay like 100 gold for mine, but it will be a noticeable increase in your DPS over either of these other two. So go for a plus 40 Shadow Wrath if you can get it. Next up is the necklace slot. This one's a little bit controversial. I strongly advise that you go for the Dark Advisor's Pendant. It gives you 7 int, 8 stam. Again, it's about 0.15% crit in the form of intellect, and then also 20 spell power. It's really, really strong. 20 spell power is a lot for the amulet slot, so it's your best option by far when stacking up spell power. A good alternative is the Star of Mysteria. This drops off the final boss of Stratholme Live side, the Demon Balnazar. It's almost identical in base stats, except instead of 20 spell power, it provides you with 1% hit. And again, Warlocks get no hit from their talents, so spell hit is very valuable on gear, but with this spell power build specifically, 20 spell power is going to outshine 1% hit every time. And this is it's just a mathematically better option to go for Dark Advisor's Pendant when going for a Shadow Power build. So Dark Advisor's Pendant, roughly 5% drop from the optional boss Vectis in Scholomance. Easy to farm, kind of rare, but worth getting. Just find some Scholomance groups and farm this. Next up on the shoulder slot, we've got another green of Shadow Wrath piece of gear. I again put Resplendent, but it can be any of Shadow Wrath piece. You just want to go for the max roll, which for shoulders is 30. Plus 30 is the maximum coefficient you can get on a Shadow Wrath shoulder. So any plus 30 Shadow Wrath shoulders off the auction house is the way to go. If you can't afford these, because again, the max rolls can get pretty expensive, about 100 gold or so for the maximum value on each piece, you can go for Fellcloth shoulders instead. These are only 4 spell power less. It is plus 26 shadow damage instead of plus 30, but the Fellcloth shoulders are very cheap to make by tailors and therefore a lot cheaper to buy as well, and they don't require some insane RNG to drop. So Fellcloth shoulders are a good option. But again, with buff scaling, the plus 4 spell power is worth it if you can afford it. Get the plus 30 shoulders if you can. Cape, you'll start to see a theme forming here. Again, we're going to want a max value of Shadow Wrath roll. On the Cape, the maximum value is 21, so you're going to be looking for any plus 21 of Shadow Wrath Cape. Technically and mathematically, the Archivist's Cape, which is a rare drop from the Archivist inside of Stratholme Live side, is the best because in addition to the shadow damage, it's also going to provide 4 MP5, so you will get a little bit of mana regen in combat, which will save you over the course of a boss fight, maybe 1 life tap, probably not, but possibly. So it is mathematically better than any other cape, but it's negligible. It's really not a big difference. So instead of banging your head against the wall, doing 200 to 300 runs of Stratholme, hoping to get this unicorn of a cape, just go for any green plus 21 of Shadow Wrath roll. I do have the Archivist Cape of Shadow Wrath, and I will say if you have infinite time on your hands, it's worth it. A lot of people compliment me on it just for seeing it, because it is a very rare roll, but it's realistically not worth going for just for 4 MP5. Go to the auction house, buy a plus 21 Shadow Wrath Cape, and call it a day. If you can't afford it, another great option is the Amplifying Cloak. It comes from Magister Calendris, the final boss. Or no, it's not the final boss. It's like the second boss, I think. The ghost boss, maybe, of Dire Maul West. So go kill him. A pretty common cape. It has 18 shadow power on it, or spell power on it, so it's just 3 less than the Archivist Cloak or any of Wrath Cloak. So go for the Amplifying Cloak if you can't afford it, but definitely go for plus 21 if you can. Next up, we've got the chest. I didn't even list any other options here because, in my opinion, this is just the way to go. The Robe of the Void is really cool. It's Warlock specific. It's got a lot of flavor to it, and it's just objectively the best option you can get in the robe slot. 46 spell power. It does also have an on-use effect to heal your pet, but most of you are going to be demonic sacrificing your pet, so you won't have one in combat anyway. And even the warlocks that do run the Shadow Mastery build are only going to be using an imp to buff the melee group, and he's going to be standing in a safe location where he doesn't take damage anyway. So the on-use effect is more or less useless, but 46 spell power is massive on the chest slot. It is better than even your raid best in slot option in terms of flat spell power, so it is your best option by far. It used to be a lot more expensive, but nowadays it's relatively cheap to craft. You can farm all the materials for it yourself in probably a few hours of farming if you feel like killing demons in Fellwood for a while. And honestly, the pattern to make this is a rare drop off of the guy in Scholomance, Darkmaster Gandling, but it's only like 10 to 15 gold on the auction house on my server because no one really needs it anymore. So it's cheap to get, cheap to make. Just get the Robe of the Void. It's really good, and it's your best option by far. Next up, I put Flame Weave Cuffs here, but again, it's just an of Shadow Wrath roll. It's objectively your best option to go of Shadow Wrath in all of these different gear slots. So I put the Flame Weave Cuffs, which drop off Lord Incendius inside of Blackrock Depths, because this will also give you 10 fire resistance in addition to the 21 spell power. But just like the cape, you want any plus 21 of Shadow Wrath green, whether it's Resplendent or Masters or whatever. Get plus 21, and if you have time, go for the Flame Weave Cuffs. 10 fire resistance is actually fairly valuable inside of both Blackwing Lair and Molten Core, so for the first half of raid content and for all the raids currently available, the 10 fire resistance will be nice, but it is not worth the time, really, unless you just want to go for them. So any plus 21 green will work. If you can't afford them, then go for the Sublime Risk Guards. They drop about 5% of the time from 2 of the different bosses in Dire Maul North. The first boss, guard Moldar, and the third boss, guard Slipkick, can both drop these. They have 12 spell power, and they also do have base stats. So you'll get 10 intellect, which is a decent little chunk of crit, like 0.18, I think, percent crit. But losing 9 spell power is pretty big, so definitely go for the plus 21 if you can afford them off the auction house. Shadow Wrath is the way to go. In the glove slot, only really one option, really easy to get. It's a craftable piece of cloth named Fellcloth Gloves. They give you 33 spell power and 9 stamina. No intellect, but doesn't really matter. We don't care about mana, and it wouldn't be too much intellect even if they came with it, so it wouldn't really be a valuable amount of critical strike chance. So 33 spell power is more than you can get on any other glove piece. They are craftable by tailors. A lot of people have this tailoring pattern because it's pretty common from Dire Maul North. So you shouldn't have to tip too much. Just find someone who knows this pattern, buy Fellcloth gloves, or if you're a tailor yourself, go farm this pattern and make them yourself. Great option for the glove slot. Really no alternatives. These are easy enough to get, and they should definitely be on your list of things to do. In the belt slot, we've got the Banthox Sash. This is just the best caster belt for everyone pre-raid, and I think I don't even know if this gets replaced pre-raid throughout all of Classic. It's got 12 spell power and 1% hit, as well as some base stats in the form of 11 intellect. It drops off of Okthor the Breaker, who's one of the bosses that can spawn inside the arena event in BRD. Tons of people run BRD looking for the Savage Gladiator chain, and it's, not much competition for the Banthox Sash anymore. Easy to find groups, very quick to run, very good belt. It does have less spell power than the AV Revered belts, so if you're purely stacking spell power, you will get 6 extra spell power if you go to Alterac Valley and get your reputation up to Revered. But you're losing 1% hit, and even though we are stacking spell power here, 1% hit is going to move the needle more than just 6 spell power is, so the Banthox Sash is just mathematically better, and it's the one you should go for. Doesn't require farming AV until you hate your life, so go for the Banthox Sash. Legs, we got Sky Shroud leggings, incredibly well itemized legs for casters. They've got 34 spell power, which is a lot for the leg slot, as well as 8 int. Again, seems to be a pretty standard number. It's roughly 0.15% crit, 0.15% crit. and 34 spell power. Very strong. They drop off of the first boss of Lower Blackrock Spire named High Lord Omok. You'll have a fair amount of competition for these because all casters want them, but they are worth it, and it's a pretty quick farm. Sometimes you can even find groups to just spam the first boss because they're looking for the gem that gets you into Upper Blackrock Spire. So this should be an easy farm and really easy to pick up. Also really strong, so great option. In the boot slot, I have put Malachi's Foot Wraps here. Now, mathematically, the best option is, again, to go with Shadow Wrath. A green plus 30 Shadow Wrath boot is going to be better than Malachi's Foot Wraps because Malachi's Foot Wraps are 27 spell power. So you are losing 3 spell power by putting on these Foot Wraps. But you're also gaining 9 intellect, which again is that 0.15% crit, which pretty much makes up for that extra 3 spell power. And purely because of the fact that you're already going to be spending like 400 to 500 gold on these other greens, the Resplendent Circlet, then the Resplendent Epaulets, potentially a Resplendent Cape and Resplendent Cuffs. Every one of these pieces will be between 50 and 100 gold if you're going for a max roll. So when the boots here being pretty much a direct side grade, you're sacrificing 3 spell power for a little bit of crit. They're more or less identical. Though technically the Shadow Wrath will give you a very, 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 very slight edge. Malachi's Foot Wraps are free. That's what I'd recommend going for. They drop off Malachi the Pallid, who is one of the middle bosses in Stratholme on Dead Side. Easy to farm. It's shadow spell power, not regular spell power, so you're not going to compete with mages or boomkins or anything like that. Just go get them. They're easy enough, and they are great boots. Next up in the ring slots, we've got 2 rings that provide 18 spell power and almost identical base stats. This one's got Int Spirit, this one's got, oh, they're both Int Spirit, but one is 6 Spirit, one is 4 Spirit. And the Songstone of Ironforge comes from a quest in Blackrock Depths to save the princess, and the Maiden Circle is a world drop BOE, and they both provide 18 spell power, which is the highest spell power ring you can get before accessing raids. Maiden Circle's really expensive. It's like 400 to 500 gold, at least on my server at the moment, so it's realistically probably not worth the money, but there aren't any other good spell power ring options, so I figured I would list it here because it is the best. You can get the Underworld Band, which is actually an epic BOE, but it has less spell power on it. The Underworld Band is 14 shadow damage, whereas the Maiden Circle is 18 flat spell power. And the Underworld Band, despite being epic, is worse and is also cheaper because I guess it's more common. I don't know. I've only ever seen Maiden Circle drop off on Onyxia, though it apparently can drop in regular world zones from regular mobs as well. But if you can afford it, grab it. 18 spell power is great, and it goes really well with the Songstone of Ironforge. Your ring slots combined giving you 36 spell power is pretty significant, so definitely go for that. And then finally, we've got the trinket slots in terms of non-weapon gear. And the 2 trinkets are both pretty obvious choices. The Briarwood Reed drops off of Jed Runewatcher in Upper Blackrock Spire. It gives 29 spell power and nothing else. But 29 is a pretty big amount of spell power, and since we're stacking it as high as we can, it is objectively the highest spell power trinket you can get pre-raid on any caster. So lots of people do Jed and Rend runs for Upper Blackrock Spire. I see them every day on my server. Just join one of those groups. Jed himself has a 33% chance to drop the trinket, so it's pretty common, and you might have a bit of competition, but hopefully you'll pick this thing up quickly. Your next best option in the trinket slot is from Dire Maul, the Royal Seal of Eldrethalas. All of the Dire Maul instances have a chance to drop class-specific books. The Warlock book is called Harnessing Shadows, and if you bring that book to the Lore Keeper in the library of Dire Maul, he will give you a trinket for your class. The Warlock class trinket gives you 23 spell power, and it is the next best option when stacking spell power to the Briarwood Reed. So these are the 2 trinkets you're going to want to use in combination with one another. You don't have to farm the book. They are actually tradable, so you can find the Harnessing Shadow books probably for about a gold or 2 on the auction house. Really cheap, really easy to get. Just take the book once you bought it off the auction house, run into Dire Maul Library and talk to the Lore Keeper. He will give you this trinket immediately. It's a free 23 spell power upgrade. Another trinket that I see a lot of people run is the Eye of the Beast. That trinket can be obtained by completing Lower Blackrock Spire and then Upper Blackrock Spire and killing the final boss of each. It provides 2% crit, which is really strong on a Warlock. It synergizes very well with the Ruin talent, but because spell power is what we're focusing on in every other gear slot, the 2% crit is actually going to be less impactful than the 23 spell power when you account for all the scaling of different buffs and things like that. So the Royal Seal of Eldrethalas and Briarwood Reed are mathematically better with this build than running the crit trinket, but if you can get the Eye of the Beast and you haven't found the Briarwood Reed yet, it is a great alternative option. Alright, so now moving on to weapons. Our primary main hand weapon is going to be the Blade of the New Moon. This is a rare drop from Imulthar, the three-headed dog in Dire Maul West, and it provides you with 19 Shadow spell power. This is the highest value of spell power you can get on a main hand weapon pre-raid, so it is objectively your best option for this build. A good alternative is the Witchblade, which only has 5 less spell power and does also offer that 8 intellect that we keep seeing on every piece of gear. So you're sacrificing 5 spell power for a little bit of crit, but the math works out so that the Blade of the New Moon is better. Dire Maul West kind of sucks to run. Not many people want to create groups for it, and it might be kind of tough to find groups to run with, but if you can get a few guildies to run this a few times, Blade of the New Moon is your best option for sure. And in the offhand, we've got the AV offhand called Tome of Shadow Force. You do need to get Exalted with the Alterac Valley faction to get this thing, so you're going to have to reach Exalted with Frostwolf Clan or Stormpike Guard, depending on if you're Horde or Alliance. But it gives you 34 Shadow power, which is much bigger than any of the alternative options, so it is definitely the one to go for if you can stomach sitting through AV. A good alternative option, if you don't have it, is the Drakestone of Shadowwrath. The Drakestone of Shadowwrath, much like the other Shadowwrath rolls, just has to be obtained. This one, though, isn't a world BOE, so you can't buy it. You have to get it as a drop from the Drakes in Sunken Temple. It's very, very rare to get the Drakestone of Shadowwrath. It's probably about 200 or 300 runs that you're looking at, unless you get really lucky. But it does give 20 shadow damage from the Wrath roll, plus an additional 7 spell power from the equip effect, so you'd get 27 total spell power out of it, which is just 7 less than the Tome of Shadow Force from AV. But the time you spend farming this thing is probably going to be more than the time it would take to get Exalted AV, and the AV rep gives you a better tome anyway, so just go for this if you can. And probably the most realistic option for most players is going to be the Spirit of Aquamentus. This is from a quest chain that starts in Angoro Crater, and it gives you 20 spell power. This is going to be considerably less than the Tome of Shadow Force. It's 14 less spell power, which scales pretty heavily, so it's not a good option comparatively, but it is probably the best and most realistic option for most players. So just go ahead and do the Lincoln quest chain. It's a pretty iconic chain that starts over in Angoro Crater. Get yourself the Spirit of Aquamentus if you can't do either of these 2 grinds. And finally, in the ranged weapon slot, we've got Skull's Ghastly Touch. It is a 14 shadow damage wand that drops off the rare spawn Skull in Stratholme. Skull can spawn in 2 different points inside of the instance, one near the main entrance and one near the service entrance. It is a very rare spawn, but the wand is a pretty good drop chance, about 33%. So when you find Skull, you have a pretty good chance of getting the wand, but he's difficult to find. It is objectively your best wand. Another good option is the Bone Creeper Stylus that has 11 spell power that drops off Darkmaster Gandling and Scholomance, but there's a lot more competition for that wand because every caster wants it, including priests. So I would go for Skull's Ghastly Touch, just reset the instance and slash target until you find him, similar to trying to find Jed inside Upper Blackrock Spire, then find a group to help you kill him. It really shouldn't be too hard to farm. I think people overstate how difficult it is to get this wand, and it remains BiS even with raid gear all the way until phase 4 when we can kill Hakar in ZG. So the sooner you can get this thing, the better, and it will be good for a very long time. And that's pretty much it for your pre-raid gear. If you stack this gear appropriately, you will be missing quite a bit on raid bosses, but when you do hit, you'll be hitting really hard. And if you have all the appropriate buffs and consumables, your crits will be hitting for like legitimately 4k damage in raids. So it is really, really good to stack spell power and just see those massive crits. They more than make up for the 16% miss that you'll have inside of raids with this gear setup. Some explanations on the gear, nothing really too crazy, just again for the of Shadowwrath, remember that it doesn't matter which named piece it is. It doesn't have to be resplendent. You just want plus 40 on the helm, plus 30 on the shoulders, plus 21 on both the cape and the bracers, and then if you go for it, plus 30 on the boots as well. But again, just kind of here a little bit more of a description on why the boots are kind of negligible, and I would just go for Malachi's foot wraps. And everything else we went over in pretty good detail. There's really not too much to explain in terms of priority here because you're not going to be spending DKP on non-raid gear. So just get all these pieces as soon as you can, and it will synergize really well and give you just a really, really good shadow power package that will hit hard all the time. Alright, and now for the fun part, getting into the raid BiS gear. Again, we're going to be excluding ranked PvP rewards and world boss gear because 99.9% of the player base is not going to have access to rank 14 weapons or to the shadow legs from Kha'Zix in the Blasted Lands. And although they are mathematically better, it just doesn't really make sense to show you the best items that you'll never be able to get. So we're making a more realistic BiS list. And also for this one, I'm going to be including a priority explanation at the end explaining which pieces you want first. Even though every single one of these pieces is the best piece in its respective gear slot, some of them are comparably bigger upgrades than others. So I'm going to be going over which items you want the most and which ones are worth spending your DKP on at the end. But first I'll just go through the entire list of items, starting with the helmet, which is the Circlet of the Mind Flayer Mishundare. This drops off Nefarian, the final boss of Blackwing Lair, so once you get that raid on farm, every single one of your casters is going to want this thing, and for good reason. It's got 2% crit, 35 spell power, and also 24 intellect, and that's almost another half a crit. It takes 60 intellect to get 1 crit on a Warlock, so 24 intellect is almost another half a crit, making this piece effectively worth 2.5 crit and 35 spell power. Crit is good for everyone, but it's especially good for Warlocks because it synergizes really well with the Ruin talent. For those that don't know, Ruin makes the bonus damage of your critical hits doubled, so the more often you crit, the more damage you're doing, and crits hit extra hard on Warlocks, so 2.5% crit is just really, really big, and this is a really good item. It's way better than your tier 2 helm, which is the current best item you can have up until this point, and as soon as you see it drop, you should be rolling on it for sure. Next up in the necklace slot, the Choker of the Fire Lord. This is one that you probably already have. It drops off of Ragnaros, the final boss in Molten Core, and it is a very strong spell power option for necklaces. It's got 34 spell power as well as 7 int and 7 stam. So it's got similar base stats to your pre-BiS neck, the Dark Advisor's Pendant, but it's got almost double the spell power. So it is a very strong option. And again, if you don't already have this, you should be one of the next in line because most people have had Molten Core on farm for several months, and this thing isn't too rare. So hopefully most, if not all of your casters have this, but it is your best option, so you should be gunning for it as soon as possible. Next up in the shoulder slot, we've got the Mantle of the Blackwing Cabal. This thing offers 16 intellect, which is just over 0.25% crit, and also 34 spell power. This one's admittedly not as big of an upgrade as some other pieces. 34 spell power is only 4 spell power more than your pre-BiS option, which is the plus 30 Shadow Wrath shoulders. It does have 16 int though, so you're getting 4 extra spell power and about 2.25% crit, which is, you know, it's an upgrade. It's not massive, but it's an upgrade, and this is the best possible shoulder you can get, so it's worth throwing on as soon as you can. Another one that's not quite as big of an upgrade is the cape slot. The Cloak of the Broodlord is your best in slot option. It's got 28 spell power and 14 intellect. So again, whereas the shoulders were just over 0.25% crit, this one's just under, but more or less it's 0.25% crit and 28 spell power. Your pre-BiS option is the plus 21 of Shadow Wrath, so you're gaining 7 spell power and you're gaining about 1/4% of crit. It's an upgrade. It's not massive, but it is your best available, and it comes off the final boss of Blackwing, so if you do manage to get one, you can show off to all the people in Ironforge that your guild managed to clear the entire instance. Next up in the chest slot, we've got the Robe of Volatile Power. This thing has got 15 intellect, so again about 0.25% crit from base stats, and then it also has 2% crit and 23 spell power from its equip effects. So it's actually less spell power than your pre-BiS option of the Robe of the Void, but 2.25 crit more than makes up for it. Again, when you factor in that the Ruin talent doubles the bonus damage of your crits, critting 2.5% more often is pretty big. So the Robe of the Volatile Power, you probably have this already, or you should be getting it soon if you haven't. Just like the Choker of the Fire Lord, it drops from Molten Core. This one drops off all the Flamewaker bosses, but it is not super rare when you account for the fact that it can drop off like 4 or 5 different bosses in the instance. So most of your casters should have this, and if you don't have it already, you should hopefully be one of the next ones up to get it. But it is definitely worth spending some DKP on because it is your best in slot robe. Next up in the wrist slot, we've got the Bracers of Arcane Accuracy. These are really, really good. There's an argument to be made that these are BiS forever for the rest of Classic. It is 1% spell hit, 21 spell power, and then 12 intellect. So your pre-BiS option is plus 21 of Shadow Wrath. So these are the exact same amount of spell power, but you get 1% hit and some crit in the form of intellect. It's a really, really strong pair of bracers. and you are definitely going to want these ASAP. They drop off Broodlord Lashlayer, the third boss in Blackwing Lair, and all casters are going to want these, so there will be a little bit more competition, but anytime you can get hit, especially on a piece like Bracers, where there's not many other options with a lot of spell power on them and you don't have to sacrifice anything to get it, you definitely want to pick them up. So these are a great piece, and they might stick with you for the entire rest of your classic journey, so really good piece here. Next up in the glove slot, we've got the Ebony Flame Gloves. These drop off the second Drake in Blackwing Lair Ebon Rock, and they've got 43 spell power and 12 intellect. So your pre-BiS and previous best gloves are the Fellcloth gloves. They've got 33 spell power and no intellect. So this is 10 spell power increase and about 0.25% crit. It's a pretty big upgrade, and I guess 0.2% crit, but 0.2% crit and 10 spell power. Definitely a sizable upgrade. Another notable thing here is that it is shadow damage, not flat spell power. So mages and boomkins and all those other casters are not going to care about these. These are only useful for shadow priests and warlocks. You will have less competition. They are a pretty common drop, and you should be able to get them relatively easily, but they are a sizable upgrade for sure. Next up, we've got the Nemesis Belt. This is the first piece of tier gear that you'll actually be wearing, and it is a really good piece. It's actually almost identical to the Mana Igniting Cord for Molten Core. As you can see here, the Nemesis Belt has 25 spell power, 1% crit, and the Molten Core Belt Mana Igniting Cord is also 25 spell power, 1% crit. So they're identical in equip effects. The only difference is the base stats, and they're very similar. Nemesis Belt has 8 intellect, whereas Mana Igniting Cord has 16. But then Mana Igniting Cord has 12 stam, and Nemesis Belt has 18. So you're sacrificing a little bit of intellect for a lot more stam. But more or less, these are side grades. They're pretty much identical belts. The reason you want Nemesis is because it's for the 3-piece set effect. Once you have 3 pieces of Nemesis equipped, you're going to be getting an extra 23 spell power. So effectively, once you have the rest of this BiS list put together, wearing the Nemesis Belt instead of the Mana Igniting Cord gives you 23 more spell power. So this belt is effectively worth 48 spell power, not just 25 when you factor in the set effect. Next up is the Nemesis Leggings, the second piece of tier gear. This is also a piece you should have by now. It drops off Ragnaros in the Molten Core. It's got 16 intellect, so again about 0.25% crit and 39 spell power. It's also got 23 stamina, which is 230 health and 10 fire resistance, so an all-around very good piece of gear. The only leggings in the game that are better are the legs that drop off of the world boss Kazek. He is very, very rare, very, very difficult to kill, and you will most likely never kill him. So even if you do kill him, you're probably not going to see the legs drop, and even if you see the legs drop, there's going to be other people in the raid that want them. So chances are you're never getting those. These are your best option, your best realistic option in Phase 3, and they go towards your 3-piece set effect, which will again give you that bonus spell power. So Nemesis Leggings are the best option for legs in Phase 3. In the boots slot, again, the third and final piece of tier gear, the Nemesis Boots. You will actually lose spell power here, which is kind of counterintuitive when we're thinking about how much we've been stacking spell power up to this point. But the Malachai's Foot Wraps give you 27 spell power, the Nemesis Boots only give you 23, but they do have a lot more base stats, 20 stamina and 17 intellect, which is pretty considerable. And again, the main reason you're doing this is because the 3-piece set effect gives you plus 23 spell power. So if you look at the fact that you already had the Nemesis Leggings, so you're not losing or gaining any there, the Nemesis Belt is the same amount of spell power as the Mana Igniting Cord, so you're not losing or gaining any spell power there, and then you're losing 4 spell power by changing from Malachai's Foot Wraps to Nemesis Boots. You're losing 4 spell power across those 3 pieces to get the set effect that gives you 23. So you're getting a net gain of 19 spell power by wearing these 3 pieces of gear. Despite the flat stats giving you minus 4 spell power across the 3 pieces, the set effect then bumps you by 23. So your net gain from 3-piece is 19, and it is the best combination of 3 pieces to wear, unless you have those legs from Kazek, in which place you want to wear tier 2 robes instead of volatile power. But again, that's not realistic for most people. Next up, rings. The Band of Dark Dominion drops off trash inside of Blackwing Lair. I believe it can drop off the Spellbinders or Warlocks, and it is really good. It's got 33 shadow damage on it, so again, less competition because you're only going to be competing with other Warlocks and Shadow Priests, and other casters don't care about this ring. It's also got a little bit of intellect and stamina on it, but again, considering your pre-BiS ring has 18 spell power, you're almost doubling the spell power here on your first ring, which is incredibly good. And not too much to say. Very strong spell power ring. better than the Ring of Spellpower inside of the Molten Core, so leave those to your mages and get this Band of Dark Dominion in BWL. The other ring is the Band of Force Concentration. This one, unfortunately, will have a little bit more competition because of the fact that it is just spell power and not shadow power, so it's good for all casters. But it is 21 spell power and 1% spell hit. So it is a 3 spell power upgrade from the Maiden Circle or Songstone of Ironforge, but it also provides 1% spell hit, which is pretty big and is really, really impactful, especially starting in Phase 4 when you get access to the Bloodvine set and a lot more hit pieces like the Cloak of Consumption. So good ring, definitely worth getting if you can snag it. But I'll explain in a little while why I'm not super hyped on the rings anymore as much as I used to be. Moving on though into the trinket slots, this is the biggest upgrade you can get in Blackwing Lair. It is undoubtedly the strongest piece of gear that you can find on a Warlock in Blackwing Lair. The Neltharian's Tear is a trinket that provides 44 spell power and 2% spell hit. It is just unbelievably well itemized for Warlocks, and given how much they struggle with spell hit up to this point, getting 2% on a single piece, especially a piece that doesn't require you to sacrifice other stats like a trinket, is just insane. So your pre-BiS trinket, the Briarwood Reed, gives you 29 spell power, so you're getting an extra 15 spell power and 2% hit. It's a massive jump in power, and I definitely recommend you spend all your DKP on this if you have to. It's a huge upgrade, and you should get it. It drops off Nefarian. As you notice, a lot of our gear comes from the final boss of Blackwing Lair, so you're going to have to clear the entire instance to really start seeing some gains as a Warlock, but once you do, you'll be rewarded in droves because a lot of good items can drop off that guy. And finally, the Talisman of Ephemeral Power. This is another one you probably already have or should be getting soon, depending on how much luck you've had in Molten Core with these. It is a really, really good burst trinket and just does an insane thing for your parses. It increases your spell power by 175 for 15 seconds, but the biggest part is that it's only a 1 minute 30 second cooldown, so it's not like you can only use this trinket once or twice per raid. You can literally use it on every boss in every raid. It cools down every 90 seconds. Some boss fights you can actually pop it twice, like during Chromagus. You're most likely going to be using that talisman proc twice. So if you have a priest who's using a power infusion on you, wait till they PI you, then pop the trinket and just burn you get insane damage. It's crazy. So 175 spell power on a 90-second cooldown. This thing is nutty, and you should definitely spend as much DKP as you need to get it. It drops off of, I think, 5 different bosses in Molten Core, but because it drops off so many different ones, it is a pretty rare drop chance off each individual one. Still, get it when you can. Moving on to weapons. No question, hands down, Staff of the Shadow Flame. Again from Nefarian, the final boss of Blackwing Lair. It is 29 intellect, which is almost exactly half of a percentage of crit. And then you also get 2% crit and 84 spell power. 84 sounds massive, but it's actually not quite as much as it seems because it's a two-handed weapon, so you don't get any spell power from the offhand slot. So it's just 84 combined from your main hand and offhand. That is still a pretty big upgrade. If you look at your previous best possible pieces, the Azure Song Mageblade from Golemag and Molten Core is 40 spell power and 1% crit. And then the Exalted AV offhand, the Tome of Shadow Force, is 34 spell power. So combined, you're looking at 74 spell power and 1% spell crit from the Mageblade and the offhand. And the Staff of Shadow Flame is 84 spell power and 2% crit, plus another 0.5% crit in the form of intellect. It's also got 24 stamina, which is 240 health. Pretty nutty there as well. So just an insane upgrade. And I would argue that the crit makes this more impactful for Warlocks than it is for mages, but you're going to have a tough time convincing all the mages in the group that you deserve it more. So you're probably going to be competing with every caster for this, but it is a very, very good weapon. And it also looks amazing. So bonus points because it makes you look really badass walking around Ironforge or Orgrimmar. And I would definitely recommend getting this ASAP. Unfortunately, there's no upgrade in any of the raids for your wand slot until ZG, so Skull's Ghastly Touch from Stratholme is still your best wand option with 14 spell power. But starting next phase, I think we get the Hand of Chaos, it's called, from Hakar, which is a little bit more spell power. So we're looking forward to an upgrade there soon, but our wand slot is finally starting to lag behind, and I actually believe it's the only slot that isn't epic. So if you get full raid BiS gear, you're going to be 100% purple, except for Skull's Ghastly Touch, but that goes away in phase 4 because we put on a bunch of blues. But that's it. That's what your gear looks like. And if you put all this gear on, you are going to be doing like almost double the damage that you did in Molten Core. It is insane how strong these pieces are and how strong all the gear really in Blackwing Lair is. But to quickly break down kind of the priority list, I would say the biggest individual upgrade, and therefore the piece you should go for first, is Neltharion's Tear. It's just kind of undisputed by most people. 44 spell power, 2% hit is too big to ignore. It's massive, and that is the first and most impactful item for your overall DPS, and the one I would recommend you spend all of your points on. Next up, Staff of the Shadow Flame. Again, we already kind of went over why, but this is realistically your next biggest upgrade. So I would say after you have Neltharion's Tear, or if you see this drop first, if you're having bad luck with tiers and you see the staff drop 1 or 2 times before you get the tier, this is another item that's definitely worth blowing all your points on. Especially just because of the style points. It looks so cool, whereas you can't see the trinket on your character. So it's up to you. This is mathematically a bigger upgrade, but this one will give you more style points, and they're both really good upgrades. Next up is the Circlet of the Mind Flayer. The only thing to keep in mind here is that you're not going to want to break your 3-piece set effect once you get it. So when you're going into Blackwing Lair, you're most likely going to have the tier 2 helmet and legs because they're already available before BWL. And so if you get, let's say, the belt, right? You get the Nemesis belt, that's going to give you your 3-piece set, which gives you that bonus 23 spell power. And then if you get a Mission Dare, you're going to be breaking that set effect. So putting that helmet on will make you lose the 23 spell power of the set effect. Granted, you can get it back later, but I wouldn't recommend putting Mission Dare on until you have the 3-piece set effect without it. So until you have boots and belt, basically, to go along with your legs. But that said, it is such a big upgrade that it might, I haven't actually simmed it, it might still be worth putting on even if you haven't gotten the 3-piece back yet, and then you'll become even more powerful when you do eventually get those 3 pieces. But to start with, you're going to have 2-piece in the form of helmet and legs, so you might not want to put Mission Dare on right away, which is why it's third on my prio list. Next up is the belt, just because of that previous mentioned fact that you want the 3-piece ASAP. Nemesis is the Nemesis belt is the only piece where you're not going to be sacrificing spell power, so it is worth getting over every other piece. Like the boots, you're losing 4 spell power. The shoulders, if you're putting those on, you'd be losing like 11 spell power compared to this shoulder. The bracers, you'd be losing a few. So the belt is your best option for not losing spell power and keeping the set effect, and that is why it is the first piece you should go for of tier. Next, Bracers of Arcane Accuracy. Again, it's equal in spell power to the Shadow Wrath Bracers, but you gain 12 int, which is 0.2% crit, and 1% hit. So these are just really good bracers. They're potentially BiS forever. You're going to have a little bit of competition with them, but they drop fairly commonly off Broodlords, so it's a great item to get, and I would put it probably 5th or 6th on your priority list, depending on how often you see it drop compared to other pieces. Next up, the Ebony Flame Gloves. These are lower on the priority list only because there's less competition for them. Only Warlocks and Shadow Priests want them. They are a considerable upgrade, which is definitely worth putting some points into, but because of the fact that they're fairly common and because there's not as much competition for them, even if you're the 3rd or 4th person to get these and you pass on them at first to save up your DKP, they're eventually going to default to you because they drop enough that there's just going to be no one left to get them. So they are not really worth putting all your points into immediately. Next up are the shoulders. Again, you're only getting 4 spell power and 0.25% crit over your pre-BiS option here, so they're not massive. They are the best in slot, but it's not as huge of an upgrade, so I wouldn't really put too much stock into these. They are not a great piece, and if you get them, you get them. They're BiS for a reason, and they remain BiS through phase 4, so you want them, but you don't want them that badly. The Nemesis boots, these are, like I said, a very similar piece to the pre-raid piece. It's a downgrade in spell power, but it's an upgrade in intellect and stam. So the only reason you want this is for the 3-piece set. You wouldn't put these on if you got them on night 1 if you didn't have the 3-piece. So, the only reason you're getting these is for the 3-piece set, and you definitely want to have them for that reason. But until you're ready to put on Mission Dare and have the 3-piece with your belt, legs, and boots, I wouldn't worry about the boots too much. And the only reason that they are ahead of these rings is because the rings are replaced in phase 4. I did not know this until I simmed it using the sim sheet that's in the description of the video, but mathematically the Zanzil ring set, which are non-epic blue rings that drop in ZG, they are bigger of an upgrade for a Warlock than having these 2 rings. And now that we have had the announcement that ZG comes out next month, it's probably realistically about 3 to 4 weeks until we see ZG. These rings are only going to be BiS for the next 3 to 4 weeks. And while they are both pretty big upgrades over your current rings, they're just not good enough to warrant spending all your points on or spending DKP on when you know that you're going to be replacing them in just a few short weeks. ZG, again, is only a 3-day reset, so you can farm it quite often. There's only 20 people in the raid, so there's less overall competition for individual pieces, and the rings are both pretty common. Granted, you do need both of them because the rings from ZG have a set effect, so you need both rings, but when you have both rings and you get the set effect, they're going to provide 3% hit from your 2 ring slots, which just outweighs the extra spell power that these 2 rings provide. And therefore, again, I wouldn't spend DKP on items that are going to be kind of outdated in just a few weeks. If Phase 3 lasted longer, then I would definitely put these much higher on the priority list. But now that we know Phase 3 is coming to a close and Phase 4 is imminent, definitely just wait and get your Zanzil rings in Phase 4. But yeah, that's pretty much it. If you get these items, you will hit incredibly hard, you will feel incredibly good, and hopefully you'll help put to rest the meme that Warlocks can't hit hard, because they do scale a lot better once hit gear comes out next phase, but if played correctly, you can still put up some really, really good parses on a Warlock, even in Phase 2 and 3, and hopefully this guide has helped you to get there. Thanks a lot for watching. Again, I know it's a bit of a longer upload, but I wanted to really go in depth and kind of explain my thought process on all of these. If you have any corrections or things that you saw that I got wrong, feel free to post in the description what you think you would do differently, or why certain things that I put in this video are not the way you would do it. But overall, hopefully it's helpful to a lot of Warlocks out there, and I look forward to seeing you guys putting up big numbers in dungeon groups on my server. Thanks again for watching. Make sure you subscribe for future content and like the video if you enjoyed it. I will see you next time.